This video is sponsored by TrueFire. Over 2 million guitar players worldwide improve their playing using TrueFire's online lesson systems. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World. We're interested in helping get the most music from the least gear. As soon as Line 6 released the HX Stomp, folks started asking me if I thought the Stomp wasn't a great example of the most music from the least gear. When this became a constant stream, I realized I needed to try to answer this question. As I thought about it, the guys at Line 6 seemed to know, and released this limited Stormtrooper White Edition version. On the heels of my all-white Rev rig, I caved, ordered one, and got to work on it. I should say that I'm probably not your average systems user. For 30 years, I had a job where I routinely had to learn new computer systems on the campuses where I worked. I would then train the campus on how to use them. So maybe an above average in ease of learning new software is appropriate here. But this also gives me a sense of when a system is intuitive and when it forces you to use the manual. And let me just say, in general, I'm a tube amp guy. I love tube amps. For a decade, I had the advantage of living down the street from Dan Lurie of FYD Amps, one of the top tube amp builders working right now. He enjoys customizing designs to meet the customer's needs, and he spent a decade building custom amps with me, answering my questions. Well, he's still kind of answering all my questions. So though I've lived in a world of computers and systems, when I sit down to play guitar, I'm looking to flip the switch on something that glows. And though I love classic sounds and would tell anyone that I'm primarily a telly guy, my version of that is a Strandberg Salin, a very modern, ergonomic nod to the tradition that Leo Fender started back in 1950. Maybe another example of that traditionalist and modernist player all in one. One of the reasons I don't do many gear reviews here is that I feel like I need to know a piece of gear before I want to start talking about it. This means playing, and playing with, that gear for months. It's a big commitment of time. It shouldn't then come as a surprise that I'm not going to make a video about a piece of gear that I can't see myself or the members of 5 Watt World using. I just value my time too much for that. So I bought the Stomp in May, and I'm just now feeling like I can share my opinions. So being that traditionalist sort of player, I also need to say that I'm not as comfortable playing through a set of studio monitors or headphones as a guy that's spent his career in a studio. I envy guys that can switch back and forth, but I'd always like to have something like a guitar speaker putting the sounds in the room. So after playing with the Stomp for a short while, I realized that I wanted to get something to play it through, something that would make it feel more like a complete amp rig. My research brought me to the Line 6 Powercab Plus, so that's part of the system I'm talking about here as well. Now, I'm not going to do a full review of these two pieces. That's been done very well by a lot of guys. Maybe the best ones are by my buddy Rhett Shull. As unusual as it is these days, Line 6's own how-to videos are really great. In the spirit of the series, I'm going to try to answer the question, could you use the Stomp and Powercab as your only amp? And like we did with the Rev 20 in the first one, and since it's 5 Watt World, let's do 5 things that I like about this rig. And I'll touch on my grumbles along the way as well. Number 1, not just one amp. The first and most obvious thing is that it eliminates the need to make the choice of just one amp at all. There are no less than 74, yeah, I counted them, different amp models in here. Everything from what I think of as the holy trinity of Marshall JTM 45, Fender Deluxe, and Vox AC30 to more rare, expensive, and hard to find amps like a Gibson GA40. And of course, I like to think of this next one as a nod to 5 Watt World. There's the Fender Tweed Champ model. And while we're on the subject, I'm missing the models of the Blackface Champ and Vibra Champ, so I'm hoping that Line 6 can fix that in the future. Having a Stomp might be just what you need to stem the tide of that collection of tube amps growing in your basement. Okay, maybe in my basement. I was skeptical, but when building the presets that I have available at the store, I spent weeks playing the AC30 models. I'm sure my family got sick of hearing me play the chords to early Tom Petty tunes as a test vehicle. And I'm so impressed that I'm going to let go of one of my favorite little amps, the AC10 C1, and just use these for the times I need a Vox on a recording. Which actually brings me to one of the criticisms I hear most often of the Stomp. Well, of modelers in general. People say they don't sound like an amp, they sound like a recording of an amp. When I hear this, I immediately remember this quote from the Premier Guitar Rig Rundown with record producer Dave Cobb.
Just on 3 or 4, put any mic on it and it sounds like a record. It's really easy.
I think what people really mean is, it doesn't feel like an amp. And as I've touched on before, for me, adding the Powercab fixed a lot of that feeling of playing an amplifier. And then, like any new rig, you need to spend time with it to understand what it feels like, what it does well and what it does less well. I'm not sure it's really so different than going from playing my 5 Watt Big Verb to, say, a 100 Watt 2-Rock. There'd be a lot of adjusting to feel in that equation as well. Just saying. Number 2, They're a great way to learn about signal chains. The USB out of your HX Stomp lets you connect it to your computer and add your presets on screen. I really enjoy this as it lets me easily play with the signal chain and listen to the results. I think of it as a producer training program. To be honest, like most people, I wouldn't take the time to build and tear down pedal boards to try these different routings. But here, it's just drag, drop, and listen. An example of how this is so much easier in the Stomp is setting up a preset like Eric Johnson's Live Rig, where he adds delay after the mic on the speaker cabinet. This is a different way of simulating a room reacting to the sound coming off the speaker, instead of the guitar signal going in before it gets to the amplifier. Setting this up in a studio is an elaborate affair, let alone trying to set it up for a live gig. But I can model this right up in the Stomp with a few quick drag and drop steps. Having the Powercab Plus is another part of this quick training program in that it lets me turn a knob to try different speaker types with an amp. I can also listen to the impact of trying different microphones. Number 3. No more fancy delays and reverb pedals. Like a lot of guys, I'm pretty addicted to delay and reverb. I figure it's the result of growing up listening to too much Eric Johnson. So going into this, I had too many pedals in each category. After spending a few weeks with the Stomp, I realized that the delays and reverb in the Stomp were better than most any of the pedals I had on the shelf. This is where Line 6 came from after all. Years of Stomp box emulations in the digital realm designed by some of the top people in the business, guys like George Trips from Way Huge. Sounds like the auto-swelling delays and reverbs, or models of units I might have lusted for, like the classic Roland RE201 Space Echo tape delay and reverb unit. But it's just something I could never have justified buying vintage. But now the model is in here in the Stomp for me to play with. And speaking of big reverbs, though my main interest in music is blues and jazz, I've always been a movie guy, and film music has long been an interest. I really enjoy what some might term experimental guitar music. People like David Torn or Mark Ribot. But again, that sort of music would end up needing a big pile of gear for what is really just a side interest for me. But with this Stomp, I can indulge that because the gear is already in there. Along these lines, I particularly like to build freeze patches that create interesting drones that help me practice modes and soloing. I learned about this reaching out to John Cordy, a Brit that has a great YouTube channel which takes a lot of time looking at modeling. I actually booked a lesson with John on how he approached building his freeze patches. I built the freeze patch in the preset pack on the back of his work, tweaking the amp, cabs, and delays to my taste. This is how I went about learning the Stomp. I bought preset packs from people that had made videos with tones that impressed me. I bought Rhett Shull's and John Cordy's preset packs to get me started, and I learned a lot looking at what they did and watching the videos about their approach. I then applied what I learned to building presets of my own that explored the sort of core Marshall, Fender, and Vox tones that make up the majority of recorded electric guitar music. Oh, and while I was at it, I indulged my love of tones by David Grissom and Jeff McErlane in there as well. So in the end, I pulled the pile of delay and reverb pedals out and listed them all up on Reverb. The sale of any two of those pedals would have covered the cost of my HX Stomp. Number 4, taste testing pedals. People ask me why I take the time to go over a piece of gear here on the channel. They even accuse me of lighting up their desire for more gear, and of course, that's the last thing I want to do. My idea is to show people what's possible, and I only highlight things that I found can reduce my gear footprint, if you will. I was always asking myself, if I had this, what could it replace? I'm always looking to reduce the total number of pieces I have with the idea that having fewer tools means that I can know each tool better. Trey Anastasio of Fish fame is known for saying, it's better to know your gear well than to have great gear, or something close to that. The models of the pedals in the Stomp are good enough to give you a sense of whether that pedal might be the sound in your head that you've been looking for all these years. For example, chasing the overdrive mix tones with fuzz that Eric Johnson uses has sent me off spending hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars on fuzz and overdrive pedals over the years. When dialing that sound on the Stomp, I found the model of the Way Huge Red Llama to really do the trick, so that's what I end up using in my Beano meets EJ preset. This resulted in a long overdue purge of fuzz pedals, which, like the delay and reverb sell-off, could have paid for the Stomp many times over. But if I was playing any kind of cover gig, or if I was going off to a level of a session that I'd be asked to do, I'd grab what I think of now as my Nashville grab-and-go pedal board that's in the thumbnail. Around the same time I got the white Stomp, I started using the J-Rocket Mark Lettieri ML overdrive and EQ pedal. I really like the warm overdrive, and the EQ's ability to sculpt the tone makes it a 2-in-1 pedal. It let me sell off my standalone EQ pedals, actually. I've long been a fan of the YouTube show True Tone Lounge, and those Nashville session guys being interviewed there always have an EQ on their pedal board. The other pedal that seems ubiquitous on those Nashville boards is an exotic RC booster. I'd never had one, so I thought I'd find one, and then I added that to the board as well. Without knowing it, I'd started to put together a very streamlined little session board. Then there's the Ibanez Mustortion as a Nashville secret weapon. The original Mustortions had become expensive, were cheaply made in the first place, and tend to be noisy, so I ordered a Karma MTN-10, which is a faithful recreation, only differing in the fact that it's bulletproof and much quieter. I integrated these pedals with the Stomp on a Monolight Plus board and realized that I had room for a 2-button switcher for the Stomp. One of my problems with the Stomp is that its tuner and tap tempo button blinks with the tempo of the delay. I find this really distracting. By adding the switcher, I can move this blinking over to foot switch 4 or 5, which doesn't have a light, so no blinking. I still have access to the tuner and, as I said, no more blinking light. And now I have 4 remaining buttons instead of 2 for turning blocks on and off in the preset on the fly. These little switches cost about $30 and are the best accessory for a Stomp. I encourage everyone to get one at the time they order their Stomp, along with a TRS cable they'd need to hook it up. With this board, I have all of the power of the Stomp and 3 separate external gain stages to choose from. I could just carry this board into a session or a gig. I'd have all the effects I'd ever need, more amps than I'd ever owned, let alone carry, and I could either bring the Powercab or leave her at home, depending on the setup at the studio I was going to. Which brings me to sharing something I realized when using the Stomp in this setup. I always end up using an analog gain stage of some sort in front. I find that the direct connection between the guitar and that bit of analog provides a much better feel going into the models. Any boost or overdrive I use seem to go a long way to making the rig feel much more like I'm plugged into a tube amp. For me, this addressed a lot of the criticism about the feel issue guys have playing modelers. Give it a try. If you're building presets, you're also freeing up distortion blocks in the preset you're building, which lets the Stomp do the high DSP function of the effects and amp modeling it does so well. And number 5, more like an amp, the Powercab Plus, a speaker modeling amplifier. As I mentioned earlier, I like to turn knobs when I can. It's more intuitive for me, and it seems to be faster on the fly when trying to dial in a sound. Rick Beato was always reminding me that having more speaker types is a more important multiplier of tones in the studio than having more amps. It was one of the reasons that I got the Powercab Plus in the first place. It has 6 basic speakers, what I think of as the 4 classics and 2 to spare. There's a Jensen P12Q, like those found in blackface Fender amps. There's a Celestion Greenback, like the classic early Marshalls. There's a Celestion Blue, the tone that defined Vox. And there's a Celestion Vintage 30, the modern mid-forward Celestion. There's an Eminence Swamp Thing, Patriot series. And finally, there's a Celestion G12M65 Greenback, one of my favorite speakers. These are models of those specific speakers in this one cab. It isn't trying to be a 4x12. Instead, it's switching between different speakers that were modeled in this single 112 cabinet. This allows all the DSP in the Powercab to focus on accurately reproducing that style of speaker, and all of those models are available at the turn of a knob. The built-in kickback stands are great for sending the sound of your guitar up and at you, and not pouring off into the first row. It also makes it handy for using it as a wedge monitor via the additional inputs on the Plus. I tend to obsess about the weight of my gear. Years of schlepping the gear from where your band can park will do that to you. The Powercab Plus weighs 35 pounds. Is that good? By way of comparison, a Deluxe Reverb is 42 pounds, a Princeton 34 pounds, and the Hot Rod Deluxe that I gigged weekly for 5 years weighed 41 pounds. So it's about like a Princeton, but with a 250 watt Class D amplifier. As I said, adding the Powercab Plus to the system really made the Stomp rig feel more like a complete amp to me. I partner with TrueFire because I've used them for over a decade, and my playing always improves when I put in the time on their lessons. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or professional level player, TrueFire has lessons to inspire and advance your playing. As you know, I always promote spending money on lessons before new gear. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. You can get 25% off courses using the 5-Watt World link in the description, or, like I have for many years, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog and see where the muse takes you. I love their tagline, learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for partnering with me on sponsoring this video. So, could this be your 1-amp rig? Of course. I'm going to try to outline a few types of players that I think this would be particularly good for. But first, who is this not going to work for? If you're a person that lives for feedback, I'd say that this is not the rig for you. One of the challenges I ran into trying to get this to act like a tube amp was trying to get it to feed back. I could get it to feedback, sitting right next to it with the volume cranked, but it wasn't the even order harmonics you'd get from a tube amp, more like the feedback you'd get from a PA. But if you're in a Neil Young and Crazy Horse cover band, modeling is probably not where you're looking in your gear anyway. So who does it work well for? First, I'd say anyone going to college to study guitar. It would give you a world of experience on how guitar tones are built. You'd have more amps at your fingertips than you'll likely ever be able to afford. You can practice silently. You're young, and the Powercab is likely very light if you're on the south side of 50 years old. Or if you're in a small cover band. I have a buddy back in Burlington, Vermont, Kevin Boyer, that in addition to being one of the best guitar teachers I've ever had, helps pay the bills by playing in a wedding band. And having a Stomp on his pedal board would cover many of his needs for tune-specific tones, and provide that all-important backup if his tube amp ever went down on the gig. And interestingly to me, guys coming back to guitar after a long absence really seem to be drawn to the Stomp. These are the folks that most often write to me about it. They didn't take the time or have the money to collect all the amps and pedals along the way, but now that they have a little money to pull this together, they enjoy all the options. Another type of player is someone who just remains curious, enjoys learning new things. Friends of 5-Watt member Bill Sanderson is this sort of guy. He has a small collection of very nice guitars and amps. He told me himself that he considers himself an analog guy, but he recently bought himself a Stomp and has really enjoyed using it. He was even gracious enough to test drive my preset pack and gave me great input on some tweaks. So thanks, Bill. And me. I see this as a way to help reduce the number of amps I have, both by giving me flavors I've never had, but also by being better than good enough to fill in for some amps that I have because, well, if I'm honest, I thought I should have them. And this whole thought I should thing is part of how I ended up building a channel with the most music for the least gear tagline in the first place. I never expected this box that you convinced me to try would help answer the question for last year's video, how many amps do you need? Is it perfect? Of course not. But is this little box kind of amazing in the same way I marvel at the quality of videos I can make with my iPhone? Yeah, it totally is. I need to thank Rhett Scholl, John Cordy, and others for blazing trail with the Stomp such that their preset packs helped me to learn the system and encouraged me to build and sell my own preset pack. I learned a lot, and it's partly their fault. I need to thank Zach Childs, who inadvertently helped me with designing my Deluxe Reverb presets. And all things having to do with a Deluxe, I put my faith in Zach. I need to thank Jeff Mackerlane for schooling me on dialing in an amp for use with a Les Paul. That information ended up informing my JTM 45 presets, and really, how I dial every amp these days. And finally, I need to thank all of you that commented and emailed asking me to check this out. I likely would never have tried one if you hadn't asked, so thanks for asking. This is definitely going to help with the most music from the least gear thing here in 5-Watt World. If you enjoyed the video, remember to hit the store for a t-shirt or to grab my Stomp preset pack. Check out our club membership, the Friends of 5-Watt. The links are in the description. All of your support is greatly appreciated. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thank you for being a part of the 5-Watt.